A paralyzed CEO sits abandoned at a romantic cafe setup, his first date having fled at the sight of his wheelchair, when a 5-year-old approaches and calls him the man with the quiet eyes. Her single mother hesitates, recognizing the same crushing loneliness she carries while raising a daughter with a failing heart and fighting medical bills that never end. Neither knows it yet, but in the next 4 hours, 3 strangers will become the family none of them knew they were desperate to find, and it all starts with a child's whisper that shatters a grown man completely. You don't have to be alone. Welcome back, my beautiful family, to Mr. Crown Stories. If no one reminded you today, let me be the one. You are worthy of love exactly as you are. You are stronger than your loneliest moments. I create these stories for souls like yours, wounded but resilient, searching for light after walking through darkness. If this story speaks to you, click subscribe, leave a comment saying I see you, and tell me where you're joining us from, because tomorrow brings another chapter of hope, and your presence matters. Every word I write is for you, the brave one who chose to keep going when giving up felt easier. May your heart find healing, your burdens grow lighter, and your tomorrow shine brighter than yesterday. We walk this journey together, shoulder to shoulder, heart to heart. Now, let us begin. Mark Wilkins' hands tightened on the wheels of his chair, knuckles going white against the chrome. Leave. Just leave. Call his driver, return to the penthouse where the silence didn't judge and the walls didn't whisper. But something stubborn, pride maybe, or the last dying ember of hope, kept him rooted to that cafe table like a ship anchored in a storm. He was Mark Wilkins, for God's sake. His tech company employed over 4,000 people across 12 countries. He built an empire from a college dorm room and 2 maxed-out credit cards. Survived a skiing accident that doctors said should have killed him. Learned to navigate a world that suddenly saw his wheelchair before it saw the man sitting in it. He wouldn't run from an outdoor cafe because some woman with perfectly highlighted hair couldn't see past his legs. The afternoon sun beat down on the patio, making the untouched cappuccino in front of him look even more pathetic. Around him, the city hummed with life, couples holding hands, businessmen closing deals, friends laughing over shared pastries. Everyone had somewhere to be, someone to be with. Everyone except him. Mark checked his phone again. No new messages. Just the one from 20 minutes ago, the one that had arrived exactly 4 minutes after she'd walked away. So sorry, family emergency came up. Maybe another time. No, another time was coming. They both knew it. He'd prepared himself for awkwardness, for uncomfortable questions about his condition, even for that particular brand of inspirational condescension that able-bodied people sometimes wielded like a weapon. What he hadn't prepared for was being abandoned before the date even started, left on display like a rejected piece of furniture someone forgot to take off the showroom floor. This is what you get for trying, a bitter voice whispered in his mind. This is what vulnerability looks like now. Mommy, why does that man look so sad? The voice cut through the noise of traffic and conversation, high and sweet and achingly sincere. Mark's head jerked up, his businessman's mask slipping for just a moment before he could catch it. A little girl stood 3 feet away, maybe 5 years old, wearing denim overalls decorated with sunflower patches. Her hair was pulled into 2 neat ponytails with yellow ribbons that matched the flowers. But it was her eyes, wide, brown, impossibly gentle, that stopped him cold. She wasn't staring at his wheelchair. She was looking at his face, really looking, with a kind of directness only children possessed before the world taught them to look away from pain. No pity. No awkwardness. Just pure, uncomplicated concern. Miriam, sweetheart, we don't point at people. The woman beside the child spoke softly, apologetically, but Mark barely heard her. He was still caught in that little girl's gaze, feeling something crack inside his chest, something that had been frozen solid since the accident. The mother stepped forward, one hand gently guiding her daughter closer. She was tall, graceful, dressed in a simple mustard-yellow sundress that somehow made the whole cafe look brighter. Her features carried exhaustion, the kind that came from too many early mornings and not enough sleep, but her smile was genuine when she looked at him. Not the practiced smile of pity. Not the uncomfortable grimace of someone who didn't know how to act around disability. Just warmth. Real, unguarded warmth. I'm so sorry, she said, her voice carrying a musical quality that Mark felt more than heard. She's at that age where she says everything she's thinking. No filter whatsoever. I like that, Mark heard himself say, surprised by how steady his voice sounded. Adults could learn from it. We spend too much time pretending not to notice things. The little girl, Miriam, cocked her head to the side, studying him with the intensity of a scientist examining a fascinating specimen. Were you waiting for someone? Because if you were and they didn't come, that's really mean. My teacher says being mean makes your heart shrink. Miriam. Her mother's voice carried gentle warning, but Mark shook his head, feeling the ghost of a smile tug at his lips, the first real expression that had crossed his face all afternoon. Your teacher sounds very wise, he said. And yes, I was waiting for someone. But I think maybe she got lost. Oh. Miriam's face brightened with relief, as if she'd solved a great mystery. Getting lost isn't mean, it's just confusing. Right, Mommy. The woman's expression had shifted, her intelligent eyes moving from Mark's face to the empty chair across from him, to the two menus still sitting on the table, to the carefully arranged flowers in the center, all the evidence of a romantic setup that never happened. Understanding dawned in her features, followed by something that looked like righteous anger on his behalf. She looked back at him, and Mark felt seen, truly seen, for the first time in 3 years. Before Mark could fully process what was happening, Miriam moved closer, her small hand reaching out to rest on the edge of his table with a kind of fearless trust that made his throat tighten. Her fingers were tiny against the white tablecloth, decorated with a plastic ring shaped like a butterfly that caught the sunlight. Why are you sitting all alone? She asked, tilting her head with that unnerving directness children wielded like a superpower. Did your friend forget about you? Miriam, honey, Elena started, reaching gently for her daughter's shoulder, but Mark raised his hand in a gesture that surprised even himself. It's all right, he said, his voice softer than it had been in months. Really? He looked down at the little girl, at those wide brown eyes that held nothing but genuine curiosity and concern, and felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. When was the last time someone had approached him without calculation, without agenda, without that careful dance of politeness masking discomfort? I was waiting for someone, Mark admitted, meeting Miriam's gaze. But yes, I think they forgot. Or maybe they remembered something more important. Miriam's face scrunched up in thought, her ponytails bouncing slightly as she shook her head. That's not nice forgetting. When I forget my library book, Mommy says I have to remember better next time. Your friend should remember better. Despite everything, the humiliation still burning in his chest, the weight of the afternoon's rejection, the armor he'd spent 3 years building around himself, Mark felt his lips curve into something that might have been a smile. You're absolutely right, he said. Elena's expression had shifted from embarrassment to something more complex, a mixture of empathy and understanding that made Mark feel exposed in a way that wasn't entirely uncomfortable. She studied him for a moment, her intelligent eyes taking an expensive suit that couldn't hide his vulnerability, the carefully styled silver hair that couldn't mask his pain, the strong hands gripping his chair wheels a little too tightly. I'm Elena, she said finally, her voice warm but cautious, like someone extending a hand across uncertain terrain. Elena Rees. And you've already met my daughter Miriam, who apparently decided today was the day to adopt every sad stranger in the city. I'm not adopting him, Mommy, Miriam protested, though she hadn't moved her hand from the table. I'm just checking if he's okay. That's different. Is it? Elena asked, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Yes. Adopting is forever. Checking is just for now. Miriam turned back to Mark with renewed purpose. Are you okay? For now. The question was so earnest, so utterly sincere, that Mark felt something crack wider in his chest, the same fissure that had opened when he'd first heard her voice. How long had it been since anyone had asked him that question and actually wanted to know the answer? I'm getting there, he said honestly. Thanks to you. Good. Miriam beamed, satisfied with this answer. Then, before either adult could stop her, she climbed onto the empty chair across from Mark, the chair that had been set for his date, complete with a folded napkin and polished silverware, and settled in as if she belonged there. Miriam. Elena's voice carried mortification now. You can't just, we weren't invited to. But the laugh that escaped Mark's throat surprised all three of them. It was rusty, unpracticed, but genuine, the first real laugh he'd produced in longer than he could remember. The sound of it seemed to transform the space around them, shifting the energy from painful to possible. "Please," Mark said, gesturing to the other chair. "I'd be honored if you'd join me. Both of you." Elena hesitated, her hand moving to the strap of her purse as if preparing to politely decline and extract her daughter from this awkward situation. But something made her pause. Maybe it was the way Mark's eyes had lit up when Miriam climbed into that chair. Maybe it was the obvious relief washing over his features, replacing the carefully maintained mask of composure. Or maybe it was simply that she recognized loneliness when she saw it, recognized it because she'd felt it herself, in those quiet moments after Miriam fell asleep and the apartment felt too empty, too quiet, too much like a life half-lived. "Are you sure?" she asked, searching his face for any sign of politeness masking discomfort. "We don't want to intrude." "You're not intruding," Mark said, and the honesty in his voice made it impossible to doubt. "You're rescuing me. There's a difference." Elena's expression softened. She pulled out the chair beside Miriam and sat down with a grace that made the simple action look elegant. As she settled in, adjusting Miriam's position and smoothing down her own dress, Mark noticed the way she moved, efficient, practiced, like someone used to making the most of limited time and resources. Her hand, he saw, bore the telltale signs of constant work, slightly dry despite obvious care, the nails short and practical, a small healing cut on one thumb. A nurse's hands. Healer's hands. "I have to warn you," Elena said, a hint of humor creeping into her voice, "Miriam talks a lot. Once she gets comfortable with someone, there's no off switch." "I have an off switch," Miriam protested. "It's just sleeping. And sleeping is boring." "Can't argue with that logic," Mark said, feeling the tension in his shoulders begin to ease for the first time all afternoon. The waiter who had been hovering nearby, the same one who'd witnessed his date's departure, who'd offered the pitying look Mark had wanted to avoid, approached the table now, his expression transformed. No more sympathy. No more careful distance. Just professional courtesy tinged with genuine surprise. "Mr. Wilkins," the waiter said, producing menus with a flourish that seemed almost celebratory. "I see you have company now. Would you like to hear our specials?" Mark glanced at Elena, who was trying unsuccessfully to hide a smile, and at Miriam, who had already grabbed a menu and was studying it with intense concentration despite probably being unable to read most of it. "I think we'll need a moment," Mark said. "But maybe some drinks to start? Hot chocolate for the young lady." Miriam's head snapped up so fast her ponytails flew. "With marshmallows. Is there any other way to have hot chocolate?" Mark asked seriously, and Miriam giggled, a sound like wind chimes in a summer breeze. "I like him, Mommy," Miriam announced. "He understands about marshmallows. That's important." "Apparently crucial," Elena agreed, her eyes meeting Mark's across the table. There was something in that look, acknowledgement, perhaps, or recognition. A silent understanding passing between two people who'd both learned that life rarely went according to plan, but sometimes the detours led somewhere worth going. "Coffee for me," Elena said to the waiter. "Black, please. I'm a nurse. I need it strong enough to stand up on its own." "And for you, sir?" the waiter asked Mark. Mark looked at the cold cappuccino that had been sitting untouched for almost an hour, the one he'd ordered when he still believed this afternoon might go differently. "I'll have what the lady's having. And bring the hot chocolate with extra marshmallows. Apparently, it's important." As the waiter departed, Mark noticed something he hadn't registered before. The cafe's ambient noise had changed. Where before every conversation had felt like a whisper about him, every glance a judgment, now the world had returned to its normal rhythm. Couples talked. Friends laughed. Life happened around him, not to him, not at him, but simply around him, as if he were just another person having coffee on a Saturday afternoon. Because that's what he was, in this moment. Not the CEO whose company stock price was trending on financial news sites. Not the billionaire whose name appeared in Forbes articles about tech innovation. Not even the man in the wheelchair who people didn't know how to talk to. Just Mark. Having coffee with a kind woman and her remarkable daughter who'd seen his sadness and decided to do something about it. So, Elena said, settling more comfortably into her chair, I'm going to go out on a limb here and guess that whoever stood you up made a terrible mistake. The directness of the statement caught Mark off guard. No dancing around the obvious. No pretending they didn't all know what had happened. That's kind of you to say, he managed. I'm not being kind, Elena corrected gently. I'm being honest. Kindness would be pretending I didn't notice. Honesty is saying that anyone who would judge a person's worth by whether they can walk isn't worth your time in the first place. Miriam, who had been studying her menu, looked up suddenly. Can you walk? Miriam, Elena started, but Mark shook his head. No, he said simply, meeting the little girl's curious gaze. I can't. I use this chair to get around instead. Oh. Miriam processed this for approximately 3 seconds. Does it go fast? And just like that, the weight that had been pressing on Mark's chest all afternoon, the shame, the anger, the bitter disappointment, lifted just a little bit more. Not gone entirely, but lighter. Manageable. Not as fast as I'd like, he admitted. But it gets me where I need to go. That's good, Miriam decided, returning to her menu. Mommy says getting where you need to go is what matters. How you get there is your business. Elena's cheeks flushed slightly. I might have said something like that. Once or twice. You're a wise woman, Mark said, and meant it. Their drinks arrived, and as Miriam dove into her hot chocolate with a single-minded focus of a child on a mission, Mark found himself relaxing in a way he hadn't in years. The cafe that had felt like a prison of judgment had transformed into something else entirely, a place where conversation flowed easily, where laughter came naturally, where the walls he built around himself seemed less necessary. For the first time since the accident, sitting at a table with people he'd met less than 15 minutes ago, Mark Wilkins felt something he'd almost forgotten existed. He felt present. He felt seen. Most importantly, he felt like maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something he didn't know he'd been waiting for. So tell me about the person who got lost, Miriam said suddenly, her hot chocolate mustache making her look like a miniature philosopher contemplating life's great mysteries. Were they really lost, or did they just not want to be found? The question hung in the air between them, surprisingly profound coming from someone who couldn't be more than 5 years old. Mark set down his coffee cup carefully, considering his answer. He could deflect, change the subject, retreat behind the walls he'd spent years constructing. But something about this little girl, about both of them really, made him want to tell the truth. I think, he said slowly, she took one look at me and decided I wasn't what she was looking for. Miriam frowned, her small face scrunching up in concentration. But how could she know that? You have to talk to people to know if you like them. That's what my teacher says. You can't judge a book by its cover, Elena supplied gently, though her eyes remained fixed on Mark with an intensity that made him feel both exposed and strangely safe. Right. The cover. Miriam's ponytails bounced as she nodded emphatically. You could be the best book in the whole library, and she didn't even read one page. That's just silly. Mark felt something warm spreading through his chest, not pity for himself, but something else. Something that felt dangerously close to hope. You know what? He said, meeting Miriam's earnest gaze. I think you might be the smartest person I've talked to all week. I am pretty smart, Miriam agreed without a trace of modesty. But I'm also hungry. Can we get cookies? Miriam Rees, Elena said, though her tone held more amusement than reproach. We just got hot chocolate. Hot chocolate and cookies go together, Mommy. Like you and me. Or like. She paused, studying Mark with that unnerving childhood intensity, like sad people and friends. They go together too. The simple logic of it, the pure, uncomplicated truth of a child who hadn't yet learned that the world was more complicated than that, hit Mark harder than he expected. When was the last time someone had called him their friend without wanting something in return? Without seeing dollar signs or business opportunities or social leverage? Your daughter, Mark said to Elena, his voice rougher than he intended, is going to change the world someday. She already is, Elena replied softly, And there was something in her expression, pride mixed with exhaustion mixed with a fierce protective love, that made Mark ache in a way he couldn't quite name. One brutally honest observation at a time. The waiter returned to take their order, cookies for Miriam, a slice of lemon cake to share for the adults, and when he left, Elena leaned forward slightly, her fingers wrapped around her coffee cup like it was anchoring her to the moment. "Can I ask you something?" she said, and there was no artifice in the question, no social calculation. Just genuine curiosity. "Of course. What do you do when you're not sitting in cafes being rescued by 5-year-olds? It was such a normal question, the kind people asked at parties or networking events or first dates that actually happened. But Mark realized with a start that he couldn't remember the last time someone had asked him about his work out of genuine interest, rather than professional obligation or social maneuvering. He could tell her the truth, that he was Mark Wilkins, CEO of Wilkins Technologies, that his company's latest AI integration software was revolutionizing 3 different industries, that his net worth was substantial enough to make Forbes' annual lists. He could watch her expression change, watch the walls go up, watch her start treating him differently. Or he could do something he hadn't done in 3 years. He could just be Mark. "I work with computers," he said, which was technically true even if it was radically incomplete. "Business software, mostly. Helping companies run more efficiently." "Do you enjoy it?" Elena asked, and the follow-up question surprised him. Most people stopped at job titles, content with surface-level answers. Mark paused, really considering the question. "I used to. Before the accident, I loved it, the problem-solving, the innovation, the challenge of building something from nothing. After." He gestured vaguely at his chair. "It became more about proving I still could. Proving I wasn't less than I was before." Elena's eyes softened with understanding, not pity. "And now? Now I'm not sure. I haven't let myself think about what I actually want in a long time. I've been too busy trying to be who I was." "Maybe that's the problem," Elena said gently. "Maybe you're not supposed to be who you were. Maybe you're supposed to be who you're becoming." The words landed in Mark's chest like stones dropping into still water, sending ripples through thoughts he'd been avoiding for years. Before he could respond, Miriam piped up again. "Do you come here a lot? To this cafe?" Mark shook his head. "First time, actually. A friend suggested it. Said it was romantic." The word felt bitter on his tongue now. "It is romantic," Miriam declared, looking around at the outdoor tables, the flowering plants in terracotta pots, the string lights that would illuminate the space after sunset. "It has flowers and everything. Mommy loves flowers. She says they're proof that beautiful things can grow anywhere if they get enough love and sunshine." "Your mommy," Mark said, catching Elena's eye, "seems to be full of wisdom." Elena laughed, a genuine sound that transformed her tired features into something luminous. "My mommy is full of borrowed philosophy from self-help books I read at 2 a.m. when I can't sleep between shifts." "You work nights?" Mark asked. "Nights, days, doubles when they need me. County General Hospital. Emergency room nurse." She said it matter-of-factly, but Mark heard the weight beneath the words, the exhaustion, the dedication, the sacrifice. "It's chaos most of the time. Heartbreaking sometimes. But every once in a while, you get to help save someone's life, and that makes the rest of it worth it." "That's incredible," Mark said, and meant it. "Truly. I can't imagine having that kind of strength." "Says the man who rebuilt his entire life after an accident that would have broken most people," Elena countered quietly. "We all have different kinds of strength, Mark. Yours just looks different than mine." It was the first time she'd used his name, and hearing it in her voice, warm without judgment, without the careful deference people usually employed when speaking to him, made something shift inside his chest. Their food arrived, and as Miriam tackled her cookies with the focused determination of a child on a mission, Elena asked more questions. Not the invasive kind, not the ones designed to extract information or establish social hierarchy. Just simple, human curiosity about who he was beneath the surface. Did he have family in the city? Parents retired to Florida, a sister in Seattle who called every Sunday like clockwork. What did he do for fun before the accident? Skiing, which now felt like a cruel irony. Rock climbing. Hiking trails he'd never see again the same way. What did he miss most? The spontaneity. The ability to move through the world without planning every step, every entrance, every potential obstacle. And with each question, each answer, Mark felt the armor he'd been wearing crack a little more. He wasn't Mark Wilkins, billionaire CEO, whose disability was an inconvenient plot twist in an otherwise successful story. He was just Mark, a man who'd lost something and was still figuring out how to live with the loss. "You have quiet eyes," Miriam announced suddenly, studying Mark's face with that disconcerting intensity children wielded so effortlessly. She'd finished her cookies and was now swinging her legs beneath the table, ponytails bouncing with the rhythm. "Quiet eyes." Mark echoed, uncertain what she meant. "MHM." Miriam nodded seriously. Like they've seen lots of things and are thinking about them all the time. Like they're sad but trying not to be. Like they're waiting for something good to happen so they can stop being sad. The observation, so innocent, so devastatingly accurate, hit Mark like a physical blow. He felt his throat tighten, felt emotion welling up that he'd spent 3 years suppressing. A little girl he'd met less than an hour ago had seen straight through every defense he'd constructed, had named the thing he'd been too afraid to acknowledge even to himself. He was waiting. Waiting for permission to stop performing strength. Waiting for someone to see past the wheelchair and the wealth and the carefully maintained facade. Waiting for proof that he could still be wanted, still be valued, still be enough. "Hey," Elena's voice was soft, her hand moving across the table to rest near his. Not touching, but close enough to offer comfort without demanding he accept it. "She's right, you know. About the waiting. But I think maybe." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Maybe whatever you've been waiting for isn't something that happens to you. Maybe it's something you let yourself have." Mark looked at her, really looked, and saw someone who understood loss in her own way. Saw the shadows beneath her warmth, the strength born from necessity rather than choice, the careful balance of hope and realism that came from raising a child alone while working herself to exhaustion. "How did you get so wise?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Single motherhood and too many midnight shifts," Elena said with a rueful smile. "Life doesn't leave much room for illusions when you're trying to keep a tiny human alive and happy on a nurse's salary." "You're doing more than keeping her alive," Mark said, watching Miriam hum to herself as she drew patterns in spilled sugar on the table. "You're raising someone extraordinary." "I'm trying." Elena's voice carried the weight of every sleepless night, every missed school event, every time she'd had to choose between being present and paying the bills. "Some days I'm not sure I'm enough." "You are," Mark said with absolute certainty. "Trust me. You absolutely are." Their eyes met across the table, and something passed between them, recognition, understanding, the beginning of a connection that neither of them had been looking for but both desperately needed. "The man with the quiet eyes," Miriam sang softly, still drawing in sugar, found friends at a cafe. And they all had cookies. The end. If only life were that simple, Mark thought. But maybe, just maybe, it could be. The waiter returned to clear their plates, his movements practiced and efficient. As he reached for the extra menu that had been sitting untouched at Mark's side, the one meant for his date, he paused, glancing at the small card still clipped to it. "Oh, Mr. Wilkins," he said, his tone apologetic as he unclipped the card. "I forgot to remove the special request note. I'm so sorry, I should have taken this when I realized." He trailed off awkwardly, suddenly aware he was about to mention something better left unsaid. But it was too late. Elena's eyes had already caught the movement, the hesitation, the carefully neutral expression on the waiter's face that spoke volumes. "It's fine," Mark said quickly, reaching for the card, but the waiter had already set it on the table, a small white card with elegant script that read, "Anniversary table setup. Flowers, candles at sunset, champagne service." The silence that followed felt heavy, weighted with sudden understanding. Miriam, oblivious to the tension, pointed at the card. "What's an anniversary?" "It's when you celebrate something special," Elena said softly, her eyes still on Mark's face, watching the color rise in his cheeks. Something important that happened. Oh. Miriam thought about this. Like birthdays. Sort of like that, yes. Mark could feel Elena's gaze on him, could sense her mind working through the details. The romantic cafe, the corner table with the best view, the two menus, the careful setup that suggested this was supposed to be more than just a casual first date. This was supposed to be something memorable. Something worth celebrating. The waiter, sensing the awkwardness he'd created, mumbled another apology and hurried away, leaving the three of them in a bubble of uncomfortable silence. "Mark," Elena said gently, and there was no judgment in her voice, just careful understanding. "You said it was a first date. But this." She gestured at the card, at the lingering evidence of romantic intentions. "This looks like something more." Mark's hands tightened on his chair wheels, old instinct screaming at him to deflect, to minimize, to protect himself from the vulnerability of truth. But sitting across from this woman who'd asked him real questions and listened to real answers, sitting next to this little girl who'd seen his quiet eyes and decided he needed friends, he found he was tired of hiding. "It was supposed to be a first date," he said, his voice low but steady. "My friend set it up. Told the woman I was successful, interesting, worth getting to know. He didn't mention the wheelchair. Thought it would be better if she met me first, saw me as a person before." He gestured vaguely at his legs. "Before she had time to make assumptions." "But she saw the wheelchair first," Elena filled in quietly. "She saw the wheelchair first," Mark confirmed. "Took one look at me sitting here, and I watched her face do this thing, this calculation. Like she was weighing whether whatever my friend had told her was worth dealing with." He paused, hating how bitter his voice sounded. "With this." Miriam had stopped swinging her legs, her young face creased with concentration as she tried to understand. "But why would your wheelchair matter? It's just how you sit down. Everybody sits down." The innocent logic of it, the absolute truth of a child who hadn't yet learned society's complex prejudices, made Mark's throat tighten. "You're right, sweetheart," he said. "But not everybody sees it that way." Elena's expression had shifted, her features hardening in a way Mark hadn't seen before. It wasn't anger directed at him, it was anger on his behalf, righteous and fierce and completely unexpected. "Let me make sure I understand this," she said, her voice carrying an edge that could cut glass. "This woman agreed to meet you, came to this cafe, saw you waiting, and left because you use a wheelchair?" She made an excuse about a family emergency. "But that's what it was about," Elena interrupted, and Mark noticed her hands had curled into fists on the table. "She saw your disability and decided you weren't worth her time." Hearing it stated so bluntly, without euphemism or social polish, made something crack in Mark's chest. He'd spent 3 years making excuses for people's discomfort, cushioning their awkwardness with his own understanding, taking responsibility for their prejudices. "I guess people have preferences," he started, but Elena shook her head sharply. "No. Don't do that." Her eyes blazed with conviction. "Don't make excuses for small-minded cruelty. Don't diminish yourself to make other people's prejudices more palatable." She leaned forward, her voice dropping but losing none of its intensity. "That woman? She wasn't someone worth your time. She wasn't someone worthy of this." She gestured at the romantic setup, at the thought and care that had gone into planning something special, or of you. Mark stared at her, stunned. In 3 years, no one had defended him like this. People had offered sympathy, platitudes about the right person being out there, gentle reassurances that felt hollow and performative. But this fierce, unvarnished anger on his behalf, this refusal to let him minimize his own worth, was something entirely new. "You don't know me," he said, and hated how his voice cracked slightly. "You don't know if I'm worth." "I know enough," Elena cut him off, her tone brooking no argument. "I know you've sat here with my daughter for the past hour and treated her like her thoughts matter. I know you answered her impossible questions with honesty and patience. I know you've been kind when you had every reason to be bitter. I know you hid who you really are, and don't think I haven't noticed you dodged the details about your work, because you wanted to be seen as just a person, not a portfolio or a position." She paused, her expression softening slightly. "That tells me everything I need to know about your character. And anyone who can't see that because they're too busy staring at your wheels? They don't deserve you." The words hung in the air between them, raw and honest and completely disarming. Mark felt something shifting in his chest, not just the walls coming down, but something deeper. The permission to believe he might actually be worthy of the fierce defense this near stranger was mounting on his behalf. Before he could formulate a response, Miriam climbed down from her chair with the sudden purposefulness of a child who'd made a decision. She walked around the table, her small face serious, and without hesitation wrapped her arms around Mark's forearm, the closest she could reach from her height. The gesture was so unexpected, so purely compassionate, that Mark froze. He could feel her small hands clutching his sleeve, could feel the warmth of her cheek pressed against his arm, could feel every barrier he'd built around his heart threatening to shatter completely. "You're not broken," Miriam said, her voice muffled against his jacket. "Mommy says broken is when something can't work anymore. But you work fine. You're just different working. And different is good. I'm different too. I have a special heart. The doctors say so." Mark's vision blurred. He looked up at Elena, saw her eyes glistening with unshed tears, saw her love for her daughter written across every feature. And he understood suddenly that this wasn't just about him. This family had fought their own battles with people's judgments, their own wars against being defined by medical conditions rather than character. "Your special heart," Mark said, his voice rough with emotion, "is absolutely perfect, Miriam. Just like you." Miriam squeezed his arm tighter, then looked up at him with those impossibly wise eyes. "Are you still sad?" And Mark realized, with a jolt that felt like coming back to life, that he wasn't. For the first time since the accident, maybe for the first time in longer than that, he felt something other than the carefully managed numbness he'd been carrying. He felt seen. He felt defended. He felt valued. He felt hope. A laugh bubbled up in his chest, unexpected and genuine, breaking free before he could stop it. It started small, almost like a cough, but grew into something real, deep and unrestrained and so rusty from disuse that it almost didn't sound like him at all. Miriam's face lit up like sunrise. "You're laughing." "I am," Mark said and laughed again, because the pure joy on her face was contagious, because Elena was smiling at him with such warmth that made his heart ache, because for the first time in 3 years he felt like maybe, just maybe, there was a path forward that didn't involve building walls and pretending not to hurt. "There it is," Elena said softly, her smile transforming her tired features into something radiant. "That's what I was waiting to see." "What?" Mark asked, still grinning despite the tears he could feel threatening at the corners of his eyes. "The person underneath all that armor," she said. "The one who remembers how to laugh." Miriam climbed back into her chair, clearly satisfied with her work. "We made him happy, Mommy. We're very good at making sad people happy." "We are indeed, baby girl," Elena agreed, though her eyes never left Mark's face. "We absolutely are." Mark wiped at his eyes, not even caring that he was crying in public, that his carefully maintained composure had completely dissolved. Because for the first time since the accident, he wasn't performing strength or hiding pain or pretending to be fine. He was just being human. Messy and vulnerable and real. And it felt like coming home. As Mark's laughter faded into something softer, a lingering warmth in his chest that felt unfamiliar but welcome, he found himself studying Elena with new attention. Really looking at her in a way he hadn't allowed himself before, when he'd been too wrapped up in his own pain to see anyone else's. The exhaustion was there in the details if you knew where to look, the faint shadows beneath her eyes that concealer couldn't quite hide, the way she held her coffee cup like it was a lifeline, the slight slump in her shoulders when she thought no one was watching. But there was also strength, the kind that came from carrying weight for so long you forgot what it felt like to put it down. "Can I ask you something?" Mark said, his voice still rough from emotion. "And you can tell me if I'm overstepping." Elena's expression became guarded, but not closed off. "You can ask. I'll decide if I want to answer." Fair enough, Mark thought. How do you do it? Work at County General, which I know means brutal hours, raise Miriam, and still. He gestured vaguely at the space between them, at the warmth she'd extended to a stranger without hesitation. Still have the capacity to care about random sad men in cafes. Something flickered across Elena's face, surprise maybe, that he'd noticed the cost behind her kindness. She was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "You make it sound more heroic than it is," she said finally. "The truth is, I don't always do it well. Some days I'm running on 3 hours of sleep and burnt coffee, snapping at people who don't deserve it, feeling like I'm failing at everything simultaneously." She glanced at Miriam, who had returned to drawing patterns in spilled sugar, humming a song only she could hear. "But I look at her, and I remember why I keep going." "Her father?" Mark asked carefully, then immediately regretted the question when he saw Elena's jaw tighten. "I'm sorry, that's none of my—" "It's fine," Elena interrupted, though her tone suggested it wasn't entirely fine. "It's a reasonable question. No, he's not in the picture. Hasn't been since I told him I was pregnant." She said it matter-of-factly, but Mark heard the old wound beneath the words. Apparently, fatherhood wasn't part of his 5-year plan. He made that very clear before he changed his number and moved to California. Mark felt anger kindle in his chest, the same fierce protectiveness Elena had shown him earlier, now reflected back at her. "I'm sorry. That's a blessing in disguise," Elena finished, and this time her smile was genuine, if a bit sharp around the edges. "I know that sounds like something people say to make themselves feel better, but it's true. A man who could walk away from his own child? That's not someone I want in our lives. Miriam deserves better. We both do." "You do," Mark agreed quietly. Elena's expression softened. "Besides, we manage. I work doubles when I can, nights pay better, and Miriam stays with my neighbor Mrs. Chun, who's basically adopted us as honorary grandchildren. We have a routine. A life. It's not what I imagined when I was young and stupid and thought love meant grand gestures and fairy tale endings, but it's ours. And most days, that's enough." Most days. Mark caught the qualifier, understood what it meant. There were other days, hard days when the weight was too much, when being both mother and father and provider stretched her so thin she could feel herself tearing. Days when managing felt like barely surviving. "What about you?" Mark asked. "What do you do when you're not working or taking care of Miriam? What's something just for Elena?" The question seemed to catch her off guard. She opened her mouth, closed it, then laughed, a sound tinged with something that might have been sadness. "You know, I honestly can't remember the last time I did something just for me. Read a book that wasn't a medical journal or a bedtime story. Watched a movie that didn't involve animated princesses. Had a conversation with another adult that lasted longer than a handoff shift report." She shook her head. "My life is work and Miriam. Everything else is just filler time between those two things." Mark heard what she wasn't saying, that she was lonely. That despite being surrounded by patients and colleagues and her daughter's constant chatter, there was a specific kind of isolation that came from being the only adult holding everything together. From having no one to share the burden, no partner to look at across the dinner table and say, "Can you believe our kid did this today?" "That sounds exhausting," he said simply. "It is," Elena admitted, and the honesty in her voice, the lack of performance or apology, made Mark's chest ache. "But you do what you have to do. That's parenthood. That's life." Miriam looked up from her sugar drawings, her ponytail slightly askew now. "Mommy works really hard. Sometimes she falls asleep in her work clothes because she's too tired to change." "Miriam," Elena said, a flush creeping up her neck. "It's true. And sometimes you cry in the bathroom when you think I'm sleeping, but I can hear you." Miriam's face was earnest, concerned. "I don't like it when you're sad." The rawness of the moment, a child's inadvertent revelation of her mother's private pain, hung heavy in the air. Elena's eyes had gone bright with unshed tears, her composure cracking in a way Mark suspected she rarely allowed. "Baby," she said softly, reaching for Miriam's hand, "grown-ups cry sometimes. It doesn't mean something's wrong. It just means we have feelings that need to come out." "But you're sad a lot," Miriam insisted. "Because of my heart." Because it costs lots of money to keep me healthy. Mark felt something cold settle in his stomach. The doctor's appointment Elena had mentioned earlier, the special heart Miriam had referenced when she'd hugged him. Suddenly those casual mentions took on new weight. Miriam has a congenital heart condition, Elena explained, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. Tetralogy of Fallot. She had her first surgery when she was 6 months old. She'll need another one eventually, when she's older. But for now, we just do regular checkups, monitoring medication. Making sure her special heart keeps working the way it should. Is that where you were today? Mark asked carefully. The appointment you mentioned? Elena nodded. Quarterly checkup. Everything looks good, stable, which is what we want. But every appointment is. She paused, searching for words. It's a reminder that we're living on borrowed time, in a way. That stable isn't cured. That one day we'll have to face another surgery, more risks, more. She stopped herself, glancing at Miriam, who was watching her mother with those impossibly perceptive eyes. But I'm brave, Miriam announced, clearly trying to reassure both adults. And Dr. Martinez says my heart is getting stronger every day. Just like me. Just like you, Elena agreed, pulling her daughter close and pressing a kiss to her forehead. When she looked back at Mark, her eyes held a complexity of emotion, love and fear and fierce determination all tangled together. So yes, we manage. We do more than manage. We fight. We hope. We take it one day at a time. Mark felt his throat tighten. He thought about his own struggles, his own pain, the humiliation of being stood up, the loneliness of his empty penthouse, the frustration of navigating a world that saw his wheelchair before it saw him. And while those struggles were real, were valid, he suddenly felt humbled by this woman's quiet strength. By the weight she carried every single day without complaint, without asking for help, without expecting recognition. Is everything okay? He asked, the question encompassing more than just Miriam's health. With the insurance, the medical bills, We're managing, Elena said again, but this time Mark noticed the slight hesitation before the words, the way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. It was the same phrase she'd used before, and he realized it was her armor, her way of saying I'm drowning but I'll figure it out without actually asking for help. He wanted to press, wanted to offer assistance, wanted to tell her that he had resources that could make those struggles disappear. But something held him back. The awareness that she'd met him as just Mark, not as Mark Wilkins the billionaire. That whatever was building between them, this fragile connection, this unexpected friendship, was based on authenticity, not transaction. You're remarkable, he said instead. Both of you. The way you love each other, the way you face everything together, it's extraordinary. Elena's eyes grew bright again, but this time with something that looked like gratitude. We're just trying to survive, Mark. Same as everyone else. No, Mark said firmly. You're doing more than surviving. You're teaching your daughter that kindness matters, that strength isn't about never being afraid or tired or overwhelmed, it's about showing up anyway. You're teaching her to see people, really see them. Like she saw me today. He paused, emotion thick in his voice. You're teaching her to be exactly the kind of person the world needs more of. That's not just surviving. That's changing the world, one small act of compassion at a time. Elena wiped at her eyes, laughing through tears. You're going to make me cry in this cafe, and I've had about all the public emotion I can handle for one day. Fair enough, Mark said with a smile. But I meant every word. Miriam, sensing the emotional weight of the moment, climbed into her mother's lap and wrapped her small arms around Elena's neck. Don't be sad, Mommy. We have each other. And now we have Mark too. Right. She looked at Mark with such hope, such innocent certainty that this connection they'd formed was real and lasting, that he felt his heart crack open even wider. Right, he said, his voice rough. You absolutely do. And in that moment, sitting at a cafe table with a struggling nurse and her remarkable daughter, Mark realized something profound. He'd come here today expecting rejection, bracing for humiliation, prepared to add another failed attempt at connection to his growing list of reasons to give up. Instead, he'd found something he didn't know he'd been searching for. He'd found family. The afternoon sun had shifted, casting longer shadows across the cafe patio, painting everything in shades of amber and gold. Mark hadn't noticed the time passing, hadn't noticed anything beyond the small bubble of warmth and connection that had formed around their table. But when Elena glanced at her phone, he saw the shift in her expression, the return of responsibility pressing back in. "Oh," she said softly, a note of regret in her voice. "We've been here almost 2 hours." "I didn't realize." She looked at Miriam, then back at Mark, her smile tinged with something that looked like reluctance. "We should probably head home. Miriam needs her afternoon medication, and I have to prep for my shift tonight." The words landed like stones in Mark's chest. Of course they had to leave. This wasn't real life. This was a stolen moment, an accidental intersection of paths that were never meant to cross. Elena had her world of hospital shifts and medical bills and solo parenting. He had his world of boardrooms and stock portfolios and empty penthouses. This had been lovely. Unexpected. Life-changing, even. But it was ending. "Of course," Mark said, trying to keep his voice steady, trying not to let her see how much the prospect of returning to his solitude suddenly terrified him. "Thank you for," he paused, unsure how to encompass everything that had happened in the past 2 hours. "For sitting with me. For seeing me. For everything." Elena's expression softened with understanding. She reached for her purse, began gathering the detritus of their afternoon, napkins with Miriam's sugar drawings, the crumpled special request card that had revealed so much, her phone with its cracked screen that she probably couldn't afford to fix. "Thank you for letting us intrude on your afternoon," she said, standing and smoothing down her mustard-yellow dress. "And for being exactly who Miriam needed to meet today. She has this way of finding people who need a little light, and I think," her voice caught slightly, "I think maybe you needed some light today." "I did," Mark admitted, his hands tight on his chair wheels. "More than I knew." Miriam had been quiet during this exchange, watching both adults with that unervingly perceptive gaze. But as Elena held out her hand to leave, Miriam did something unexpected. She reached across the table, grabbed one of the menus they hadn't opened, and pulled it close to her chest like a shield. Then, with the deliberate determination of a child who'd made up her mind about something important, she climbed back into the empty date chair, Mark's date chair, the one that had symbolized his rejection and humiliation just hours ago, and planted herself there with her arms crossed. "Miriam," Elena said, confusion flickering across her features. "Come on, sweetie. We need to go." "No," Miriam said, her small voice carrying surprising firmness. "I want to stay with him." The simple declaration hung in the air, weighted with innocent certainty. Mark felt his breath catch, felt something shift in his chest, not just warmth now, but something deeper. Something that felt dangerously close to belonging. "Baby, we can't just stay," Elena said gently, moving closer to her daughter. "Mark probably has things to do, places to be." "But he's lonely," Miriam interrupted, her brown eyes moving from her mother to Mark and back again. "His quiet eyes aren't sad anymore, but they're still lonely. And you're always saying we shouldn't leave people lonely if we can help it." Elena's face did something complicated, pride and exasperation and recognition all tangled together. Because her daughter was right. She had taught her that. Had raised her to see loneliness and respond with compassion, to choose kindness even when it was inconvenient. And now that lesson was being reflected back at her in the most impossible way. Mark watched Elena hesitate, watched her internal struggle play out across her features. He wanted to make it easier for her, wanted to tell her it was fine, that they should go, that he'd be okay alone. But he couldn't make the words come. Because they'd be a lie. Elena looked at him, really looked at him, and Mark knew she was seeing everything he was trying so hard not to show. The loneliness that had nothing to do with his wheelchair and everything to do with being surrounded by people who wanted something from him but never actually saw him. The exhaustion of performing strength when what he wanted was permission to be weak. The quiet desperation of someone who'd convinced himself he was fine with solitude, but was actually starving for genuine connection. She saw his quiet loneliness. The vulnerability he tried to hide behind expensive suits and carefully constructed walls. And something in her expression shifted, softened and solidified at the same time. "Miriam," Elena said slowly, her eyes still on Mark's face, You can't just decide for people that we're staying. That's not how it works. But I want to, Miriam insisted, hugging the menu tighter. And I think he wants us to too. He just doesn't want to ask because he thinks he's supposed to be okay alone. But nobody's supposed to be okay alone. Right, Mommy? Elena's breath caught. Mark saw her eyes grow bright, saw her struggle with some internal decision that felt enormous despite its simplicity. Right, she whispered. Then louder to Mark, would you like us to stay? And I need you to be honest. Not polite. Honest. Mark looked at her, this remarkable woman who defended him to himself, who'd shared her own struggles without shame, who'd taught her daughter to see people's hearts before their circumstances. He looked at Miriam, clutching that menu like a declaration of intent, her ponytail slightly askew and her face smudged with chocolate. And he chose honesty. Yes, he said, his voice breaking on the word. God, yes. I would very much like you to stay. Something shifted in Elena's expression, relief, maybe, or recognition. As if she'd been waiting for permission to want this too. To admit that she was tired of carrying everything alone, that maybe she also needed to sit with someone who saw her, who didn't need anything from her except her presence. She pulled out her chair again, the one she'd vacated moments ago, and sat down with a decisiveness that felt like a promise. Okay then, she said simply. Miriam beamed triumphant, settling more comfortably into her claimed territory. See? That was easy. Adults make everything so complicated. Mark felt a laugh bubble up, rough and surprised. We really do. Elena reached across the table, her hand stopping just short of his. Not touching, but close enough that Mark could feel the warmth of her skin, could see the slight tremor in her fingers that said this moment meant something to her too. No one has sat with me like this in a long time, Mark said, the words coming out as barely more than a whisper. Not just sat physically, but sat with all of him, the broken parts and the surviving parts and the parts still trying to figure out how to live. Elena's eyes held his, and in them Mark saw understanding recognition, the reflection of his own loneliness mirrored back. She'd been alone too, he realized. Not physically, she had Miriam, had colleagues, had Mrs. Chen next door, but alone in the way that mattered. Alone in carrying the weight, in making all the decisions, in having no partner to turn to at the end of a hard day and say, I need help. Then today's a good day to begin again, Elena said softly, and there was something in her voice, promise, hope, determination, that made Mark's throat tighten with emotion. Begin again. Not start over, because you couldn't erase the past, the accident that had taken his legs, the father who'd abandoned his daughter, the struggles they'd both faced and survived. But begin again, from this moment forward. With honesty instead of performance. With vulnerability instead of armor. With connection instead of isolation. Yes, Mark said, his voice steadier now. It is. Miriam, satisfied that the adults had finally figured out what she'd known all along, returned to her sugar drawings. But her presence in that chair, the one meant for someone who'd rejected Mark, now occupied by a child who'd chosen him, felt symbolic in a way that made Mark's chest ache. The waiter approached again, clearly confused by their continued presence, but too professional to comment. Can I get you anything else? Elena looked at Mark, a question in her eyes. Do you have time? And Mark, who had an empire to run and emails piling up and a calendar full of meetings he'd probably already missed, found that he didn't care about any of it. I have all the time in the world, he said. Then we'll have another round, Elena told the waiter. And maybe some of those cookies Miriam saw earlier? With chocolate chips. Miriam added. Because beginning again deserves chocolate chips. Can't argue with that logic, Mark said, and realized he was smiling, really smiling, in a way that felt like his face had forgotten how and was just now remembering. As the waiter departed and conversation resumed, easier now, deeper, like they'd crossed some invisible threshold, Mark felt something settle in his chest. Not the heavy weight of loneliness or the sharp ache of rejection, but something warm and unexpected. Hope. For the first time in 3 years, Mark Wilkins sat at a cafe table and didn't feel like he was performing or hiding or barely surviving. He felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be, with exactly the people he was meant to find. And maybe, just maybe, This was the beginning of something that would change all their lives in ways none of them could yet imagine. The afternoon sun continued its slow descent, painting the cafe in shades of gold and amber, and three people who'd been strangers hours ago sat together like they'd known each other for lifetimes. Because some connections transcended logic and circumstance. Some connections were simply meant to be. The cafe had grown quieter as the afternoon stretched into early evening. Other patrons had come and gone, their conversations and laughter forming a gentle backdrop to the cocoon of intimacy that had formed around Mark's table. The cookies had been reduced to crumbs, the coffee cups refilled twice, and somewhere along the way, the careful distance between strangers had dissolved into something that felt startlingly like trust. Miriam had migrated back to her mother's lap, drowsy from sugar and the warmth of the fading sun, her head resting against Elena's chest while she played with the edge of her mother's dress. Her presence was soothing, a reminder that vulnerability didn't always require words, that sometimes comfort was just the weight of someone choosing to stay. "Can I tell you something?" Mark said suddenly, the words escaping before he could second-guess them. "Something I haven't told anyone. Not my friends, not my therapists, not even my sister who calls every Sunday and asks how I'm really doing." Elena's attention sharpened, but her expression remained open, inviting. "You can tell me anything. Or nothing. Whatever you need." Mark's hands moved to his wheels, gripping them the way he always did when anxiety threatened to overwhelm him. But this time, instead of rolling away from discomfort, he forced himself to sit with it. To lean into the vulnerability. "The accident," he began, his voice low but steady, "was 3 years ago. February 14th, actually. Valentine's Day." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I'd been skiing in Colorado, a trip I'd planned for months. I was good at it, confident. Maybe too confident. There was this run, a black diamond that I'd done dozens of times before. But that day, there was ice hidden under fresh powder. My ski caught, I went down wrong and—" He paused, the memory still vivid despite the years. The sickening crack. The immediate knowledge that something fundamental had broken. The helicopter ride. The surgery. Waking up to a doctor telling him he'd never walk again. "Spinal cord injury," he continued. "T10 complete. Which means everything from my waist down just stopped working. No feeling. No movement. Nothing." Miriam stirred in her mother's arms, her sleepy eyes finding Mark's face. "Did it hurt?" "At first, yes. But then it stopped hurting, and that was worse. Because the absence of pain meant the absence of everything." Mark met the little girl's gaze, seeing only curiosity and compassion there. "Your body becomes this stranger you're living with. This thing that doesn't do what you tell it anymore." Elena's hand moved to rest on the table between them, palm up, an offering, not a demand. Mark looked at it for a long moment before placing his own hand in hers. Her fingers closed around his, warm and steady. "The physical recovery was hard," Mark continued, his voice gaining strength from her touch. "Months of rehabilitation, learning to do everything differently. But the hardest part, the part no one prepares you for, is losing your independence in ways that have nothing to do with your legs." "What do you mean?" Elena asked softly. Mark took a breath, organizing thoughts he'd kept locked away for so long they'd started to rot. "I mean the shame of needing help with things you used to do without thinking. I mean the frustration of buildings without ramps, of bathroom stalls too narrow for wheelchairs, of people who talk to whoever I'm with instead of talking to me, like the wheelchair came with aphasia." His voice grew harder, years of accumulated anger bleeding through. "I mean the exhaustion of constantly proving I'm still capable, still intelligent, still worthy of respect, when before the accident, people just assumed those things." "People are idiots," Miriam mumbled sleepily, and despite everything, Mark felt a smile tug at his lips. "Sometimes they are, sweetheart," he agreed. Then to Elena, "But the worst part is the loneliness. Not the obvious kind. I have colleagues, employees, people who need things from me. But I'm admired, not known. People see the CEO who overcame adversity, the inspirational figure who didn't let disability stop him. They don't see the man who sits in his penthouse at night wondering if this is all there is. If he'll spend the rest of his life being someone's cautionary tale or motivation poster instead of just being a person. Elena's fingers tightened around his. That sounds unbearable. It is, Mark said, the admission feeling like lancing a wound. And the cruelty of it is that people think they're being kind. They tell me I'm brave, that I'm an inspiration, that I should be grateful I survived. And I am grateful, I know how lucky I am. But there's this subtle violence in telling someone they should be grateful for less. In suggesting that survival is enough, that I should be satisfied with a half-life because at least I'm alive. His voice had risen slightly, emotion cracking through his careful control. They see the wheelchair before they see me. Always. Every single time. And I'm so tired of it. Tired of being defined by the thing I can't do instead of everything I can. Tired of dating profiles that ghost me the moment they learn I'm disabled. Tired of watching people's faces do that thing, that calculation where they decide whether I'm worth the effort. Like your date today, Elena said quietly. Like my date today. Mark's laugh was bitter. And every date before her. Every woman who smiles politely and then suddenly remembers she has somewhere else to be. Every connection that dies the moment they see the chair. Miriam had fallen fully asleep now, her breathing deep and even against her mother's chest. But Elena's eyes never left Mark's face, her expression unwavering in its intensity. I'm so angry, Mark confessed, the words tumbling out now like water from a broken dam. All the time. At the person who left those conditions unreported. At myself for being too confident, too reckless. At my body for betraying me. At every person who treats me like I'm less than I was, like I'm broken, like my worth decreased the day my legs stopped working. His voice broke. And I'm terrified that they're right. That I am broken. That this is all I'll ever be, a man in a wheelchair that people pity or avoid or use as their daily dose of inspiration porn. The silence that followed felt enormous, weighted with everything Mark had finally allowed himself to say. He waited for Elena to pull back, to offer platitudes, to do what everyone else did. Tell him it would get better, that he was strong, that he'd overcome this. Instead she leaned forward, her free hand coming up to rest over their joined hands. Mark, she said, her voice carrying absolute conviction, you're not broken. I am, he started, but she shook her head. No. Listen to me. Her eyes blazed with fierce certainty. Broken is when something can't function anymore, when it's beyond repair, when its purpose is lost. That's not you. You're rebuilding. And rebuilding is different. Mark felt his breath catch. I don't understand. When something breaks, Elena continued, her words measured and deliberate, you have two choices. You can throw it away because it's not what it used to be, or you can rebuild it into something new. Different from the original, yes. But not less than. Just different. She squeezed his hand. You're not the man you were before the accident. That man is gone, and grieving him is valid and necessary. But the man you're becoming? The one who's learning to live with limitations, who's figuring out new ways to navigate the world, who's building a life that looks nothing like what he planned but might be something valuable anyway. He's not broken. He's under construction. Mark felt tears burning at the back of his eyes. You make it sound noble. It doesn't feel noble. It feels like failure. That's because you're measuring yourself against who you used to be instead of who you're becoming, Elena said gently. And that's an impossible standard. You're comparing your present to someone else's past, even if that someone is you. But I lost so much. You did, Elena agreed, and her refusal to minimize his loss felt like a gift. You lost mobility, independence, the easy path forward. You lost the life you'd imagined for yourself. Those losses are real and devastating, and anyone who tells you otherwise is lying. She paused, making sure he was listening. But losing something doesn't make you broken. It makes you changed. And change, even painful change, isn't the same as destruction. Mark stared at her, this woman he'd known for mere hours, but who somehow understood him better than people he'd known for years. How do you know this? A sad smile crossed Elena's face. Because I've been there. Not with disability. I won't pretend to understand that specific experience. But with having your life shatter and having to build something new from the pieces. When Miriam's father left, when the doctors told me about her heart condition, when I realized I'd be doing all of this alone, I felt broken too. Like the life I'd planned was destroyed and what remained wasn't enough. But you're not broken, Mark said. Neither are you, Elena replied firmly. We're both rebuilding. Some days better than others. Some days it feels impossible. But impossible isn't the same as broken. Mark let the words sink in, feeling them settle into places that had been empty for so long he'd forgotten they existed. You're not broken. You're rebuilding. That's different. Nobody had ever framed it that way. Every therapist, every friend, every well-meaning article about resilience had focused on overcoming, on returning to normal, on proving the disability didn't define him. But Elena was saying something else entirely, that being defined by his disability wasn't the problem. The problem was thinking definition meant limitation. I don't know how to rebuild, he admitted quietly. I don't know who I'm supposed to become. Nobody does, Elena said. That's the terrifying part. But maybe, she glanced down at her sleeping daughter, at this small person who saw the world with such clarity, maybe we don't figure it out alone. Maybe rebuilding is something we do together, with people who see us. Really see us. Mark looked at her, at Miriam peaceful in her arms, at this unexpected family that had chosen to stay when they could have left. And he felt something shift in his chest, not healing exactly, but the possibility of healing. The understanding that maybe he didn't have to carry this alone anymore. Thank you, he said, his voice rough with emotion. For listening. For not flinching. For, he gestured helplessly, unable to find words adequate for what she'd given him. For seeing you? Elena supplied gently. Yes, Mark breathed. For seeing me. And in that moment, sitting in a cafe as the sun set and the string lights began to glow, Mark Wilkins felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years. He felt whole. The string lights had begun to glow softly against the deepening twilight, casting everything in a warm golden haze that made the moment feel suspended in time, as if the cafe existed in its own separate universe where pain could be spoken aloud and healing could begin with honesty. Mark sat with his hand still clasped in Elena's, feeling the echo of his own words settling into the space between them. He'd said things he'd never planned to say, revealed wounds he'd spent 3 years hiding, and instead of the shame he'd expected to feel, there was only relief. The kind of bone-deep relief that comes from finally setting down a weight you've been carrying so long you'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. But with relief came something else, something more complicated. Gratitude so profound it bordered on overwhelming. This woman had given him something precious, the gift of being fully seen without being diminished. And he didn't know how to thank her for that. Didn't know if words even existed that could encompass what she'd done by simply listening, by staying, by refusing to let him minimize his own pain. Elena, Mark started, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to steady it. I don't know how to thank you for. He stopped, struggling to find language adequate for what he was feeling. His throat tightened with emotion, making speech difficult. Everything he wanted to say felt insufficient, too small to contain the enormity of what had shifted inside him in the past few hours. For staying, he managed finally, each word carrying weight. For listening without trying to fix me. For telling me I'm rebuilding instead of broken. For. His voice cracked, and he had to pause, blinking rapidly against the sudden burning in his eyes. Successful businessmen didn't cry in cafes. CEOs maintained composure. Mark Wilkins, the man who'd rebuilt an empire from a hospital bed, didn't break down in public. But maybe that was the point. Maybe Mark Wilkins, the CEO, needed to step aside so Mark the human being could finally feel something real. Before he could finish his thought, before he could force out the inadequate words crowding his throat, he felt something small and warm slide across the table. Miriam's hand. She'd woken from her drowsy state in her mother's lap, and now, with the unhesitating certainty of a child who understood things adults spent years unlearning, she reached across the table and laid her small hand palm down over Mark's. The gesture was so gentle, so devastatingly pure, that Mark froze completely. He stared down at her tiny fingers resting on his larger hand, at the contrast between her smooth skin and his weathered knuckles, at the butterfly ring she still wore catching the string lights. "You don't have to be alone," Miriam whispered. 4 words. 22 letters. One simple statement that shattered every defense Mark had spent 3 years constructing. The tears he'd been fighting spilled over, burning hot tracks down his cheeks before he could stop them. His chest constricted with emotion so powerful it bordered on physical pain. Not the pain of injury, but the pain of something frozen finally beginning to thaw. Something dead learning to breathe again. "Miriam," Elena said softly, but there was no reprimand in her voice. Only wonder. Mark couldn't speak. Couldn't move. Could barely breathe around the enormity of what this child had just given him: permission. Permission to need people. Permission to want connection. Permission to believe that maybe loneliness wasn't his permanent condition, that maybe isolation wasn't the price he had to pay for survival. "I mean it," Miriam continued, her brown eyes serious and ancient beyond her 5 years. "You were alone before, but now you have us. Me and Mommy. We're your friends now. So you don't have to be alone anymore." The simple logic of it, the absolute certainty in her voice that friendship was just that easy, that connection could be chosen and claimed without negotiation or performance, broke something fundamental in Mark's chest. He'd spent 3 years believing he had to earn people's presence, had to prove he was worth the inconvenience of his disability, had to be impressive enough or successful enough or inspirational enough to justify someone's time. He'd forgotten that love, real love, the kind that mattered, wasn't transactional. It was offered freely or it wasn't love at all. And this child, this remarkable little girl with a special heart and wisdom that defied her age, was offering it freely. "I don't," Mark's voice came out strangled, broken. "I don't deserve." "Yes you do," Miriam interrupted with the firm conviction of someone stating an obvious fact. "Everybody deserves friends. Everybody deserves people who stay. That's what Mommy teaches me. She says the world tries to make us think we have to be special or perfect to deserve love, but that's a lie. We deserve love just because we're here. Just because we're us." Mark looked up at Elena through tear-blurred vision, saw her own eyes glistening, saw her watching this moment unfold with an expression that held equal parts pride and heartbreak. She was crying too, he realized, silent tears tracking down her cheeks as she witnessed her daughter's compassion, as she watched Mark's walls crumble under the weight of simple kindness. "She's right," Elena said, her voice thick with emotion. "You deserve connection, Mark. Not because you've overcome something or built something or proved something. Just because you're human. Just because you're you." Mark's hand trembled beneath Miriam's, his entire body shaking with the force of suppressed sobs. He'd cried before, in the hospital after the accident, in rehabilitation when the reality of his new life had crashed down on him, in the privacy of his penthouse when loneliness became unbearable. But those had been tears of grief, of rage, of bitter acceptance. These tears were different. These tears were hope. "I've been so lonely," Mark whispered, the admission feeling like exposing his soul. "So incredibly lonely. And I convinced myself that was just how it would be now. That this was the trade-off for surviving. I got to keep living, but I had to do it alone because who would want?" He couldn't finish. The old narrative, the one that said his disability made him unlovable, that his wheelchair made him a burden, that his limitations meant he should be grateful for scraps of connection, had played in his head so long it had become truth. But Miriam's hand in his, warm and steady and offered without hesitation, was writing a new truth. "You're not alone anymore," Miriam said with absolute finality. "We're here. And we're staying." Elena reached across with her free hand, covering both Mark's and Miriam's with her own, creating a chain of connection that felt like a promise, like an anchor, like coming home. "We're staying," she echoed, and the certainty in her voice made Mark believe it might actually be true. Mark looked at them, this woman who defended him to himself, who'd given him permission to grieve and rebuild simultaneously, and this child who'd seen his quiet eyes and decided they shouldn't be lonely anymore, and felt something shift permanently in his chest. The walls he'd built, brick by brick, defense by defense, year by year, began to fall. Not violently, not all at once, but steadily. Inevitably. Each brick dissolving under the warmth of genuine connection, of being chosen, of mattering to someone without having to earn it. He watched it happen in real time, felt each defense mechanism crumble, felt the armor he'd worn for 3 years become unnecessary weight he could finally set down. And underneath all that protection, underneath all that careful control, Mark found something he'd thought died in that hospital bed 3 years ago. He found himself. The real version. The one who could be vulnerable without being weak, who could need people without being needy, who could accept love without feeling like he was taking something he didn't deserve. "I don't know how to do this," Mark admitted, his voice raw but steady. "I don't know how to let people in anymore. I don't know how to trust that they'll stay." "That's okay," Elena said gently. "We don't know how to do this either. Single parenting, chronic illness, building a life from broken pieces. None of us have a manual for any of this. We're all just figuring it out as we go." "Together," Miriam added, squeezing Mark's hand. "We figure it out together. That's what friends do." Mark let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding, felt it leave his body along with some of the fear he'd been carrying. Not all of it. Fear born from years of rejection didn't disappear in an afternoon. But enough. Enough to make space for something else. Hope. Real, tangible hope that maybe his story wasn't over. That maybe the accident had taken his legs but not his future. That maybe he could build a life worth living not despite his disability but as himself, wheelchair and all, with people who saw him as whole rather than broken. "Okay," Mark said, and the word felt like a declaration. Like a choice. Like the first step of a very long journey. "Okay. Together." Miriam beamed, her entire face transforming with joy so pure it was almost painful to witness. "See? I told you we'd make him not sad anymore." "You did," Elena agreed, her smile radiant despite the tears still tracking down her face. "You absolutely did." The cafe continued its evening rhythm around them, other patrons coming and going, the waiter making his rounds, the city humming with life beyond their small bubble of connection. But for Mark, the entire world had narrowed to this table, these two people, this moment of absolute transformation. For the first time since the accident, since before the accident maybe, since some part of him had been lonely long before he lost his legs, Mark Wilkins felt something he'd stopped believing was possible. He felt hope. He felt seen. He felt like maybe, just maybe, he deserved both. And in the glow of string lights and the warmth of hands clasped across a cafe table, 3 broken people who'd found each other by accident became something new. They became family. Not the family you're born into, but the family you choose. The family that chooses you back. The family that looks at your scars and your struggles and says, "You don't have to carry this alone anymore." Mark cried. Elena cried. Miriam watched them both with satisfaction, clearly pleased with her work. And somewhere between the tears and the laughter that followed, between the weight of the past and the possibility of the future, Mark began to believe in something he'd thought he'd lost forever. He began to believe in tomorrow. The sky had deepened to indigo, the first stars beginning to pierce through the city's ambient glow. The cafe's string lights cast pools of warm gold across the patio, and somewhere nearby, a street musician had begun playing something soft and melancholic on a guitar. The evening had that quality of gentle finality, the sense of something precious drawing to its natural close. Elena glanced at her phone, and Mark saw the subtle shift in her expression, the return of responsibility pressing back into her awareness. The real world, with its demands and schedules and obligations, was calling them back. "It's almost 7, she said quietly, regret coloring her voice. "I need to get Miriam home, give her the evening medication, get some food in her before my shift starts at 9. She looked at Mark, and he saw genuine reluctance in her eyes. "I wish we could stay longer." "Me too," Mark said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. Miriam, who had been leaning contentedly against her mother's side, sat up with sudden alertness. "Do we have to go? Can't we stay a little more?" "We've been here almost 4 hours, baby girl," Elena said gently, stroking her daughter's hair. "And as magical as this afternoon has been, we have real life to get back to." Mark felt something cold settle in his chest, not the familiar loneliness exactly, but fear. Fear that this had been a beautiful anomaly, a single perfect afternoon that would dissolve like morning mist the moment they stood up from this table. Fear that tomorrow he'd wake up in his empty penthouse and wonder if any of this had actually happened, or if desperation had conjured an impossible connection from thin air. Elena began gathering their things, her purse with its worn strap, Miriam's small backpack decorated with cartoon characters, the napkins covered in sugar drawings that Miriam insisted on keeping. Each movement felt like a countdown, like watching something precious slip away second by second. Mark's hands gripped his chair wheels, the familiar anxiety rising in his throat. Let them go. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. You've already taken up enough of their time. But then he remembered what Elena had said, you deserve connection just because you're you. And he remembered Miriam's small hand in his, you don't have to be alone anymore. Maybe he didn't have to let fear make his decisions. Maybe he could choose courage instead. Elena, Mark said, his voice catching slightly on her name. She looked up from organizing their things, her expression open and attentive. Mark took a breath, feeling his heart hammering against his ribs. This was terrifying in a way that boardroom negotiations and business deals had never been. This was the kind of vulnerability that came without armor, without the safety net of professional distance. Would you, he stopped, forced himself to continue. Would you both like to meet here again? The question hung in the air between them, weighted with everything unspoken. Mark held his breath, waiting for the polite decline, the gentle letdown, the kind brush-off that would confirm his worst fear, that today had been charity, not connection. That they'd given him a beautiful afternoon out of pity, but now real life would reclaim them and he'd return to being alone. He expected her to say no. To offer some excuse about busy schedules or to suggest the vague we'll see that adults used when they meant no, but didn't want to hurt feelings. Instead, Elena went very still. She looked at him, really looked at him, with an intensity that made Mark feel simultaneously exposed and safe. He watched her process the question, saw something shift in her expression as she weighed not just her answer but its implications. Yes, she said finally, and the word was simple but absolute. Next Saturday. Same time. 2:00. Mark felt his breath leave his body in a rush, felt relief and joy and disbelief crash over him in waves. You really? Really, Elena confirmed, and her smile was radiant. I've already spent 4 hours with you today, Mark. 4 hours where I didn't think about medical bills or double shifts or whether I'm failing at single parenthood. 4 hours where I got to just be Elena, talking with someone who sees me as a person, not just a nurse or a mother or a problem to be solved. Her voice softened. Why would I not want more of that? Because Mark gestured vaguely at himself, at his chair, at all the complications he represented. Because you're what? Elena challenged gently. Because you use a wheelchair? Because you have your own struggles? Mark, everyone has complications. Everyone carries weight. The question isn't whether someone has baggage, it's whether they're willing to help you carry yours while you help them carry theirs. Before Mark could respond, Miriam launched herself at him with the unrestrained enthusiasm of a child who'd heard exactly what she wanted to hear. Her small arms wrapped around his neck, squeezing with surprising strength for someone so tiny. We're coming back, she squealed directly into his ear. Next Saturday. I'm going to draw you a picture this week of all of us having coffee together, and I'll bring it to show you. Mark's arms came up automatically, carefully holding this precious child against his chest, feeling her heartbeat, that special brave heart, drumming rapidly with excitement. His vision blurred again, but this time the tears were pure joy. I can't wait to see it, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Miriam pulled back, her hands on his shoulders, looking at him with utter seriousness. You promise you'll be here? You won't get lost like the other lady. The question was innocent but devastating. This child, who'd already learned that people could disappear, who'd already experienced abandonment through her absent father, was asking him for a promise. Trusting him with her hope. I promise, Mark said, and he'd never meant anything more in his life. Wild horses couldn't keep me away. What if there are wild horses? Miriam asked, concerned. Then I'll give them coffee and cookies until they let me pass, Mark said seriously. Miriam giggled, satisfied with this plan. She kissed his cheek, a quick sticky kiss that would probably leave a residue of hot chocolate, and then climbed down, taking her mother's hand. Elena shouldered her bag, adjusted Miriam's backpack, and looked at Mark one more time. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For today. For your honesty. For seeing us too." "Thank you for stopping," Mark replied. "For staying. For," he gestured helplessly at the table, at the space where something extraordinary had happened. "For all of it." "Next Saturday," Elena said again, making it real, making it a commitment neither of them could pretend was just politeness. "Next Saturday," Mark echoed, and it felt like a promise. Like a beginning. They walked away then, Miriam's hand in her mother's, the little girl turning back every few steps to wave enthusiastically at Mark. He waved back each time, watching them navigate through the evening crowd, Elena's yellow dress a splash of sunlight against the darkening street, Miriam's ponytails bouncing with each step. Mark remained at the cafe table, alone once more. The waiter approached to clear the dishes, the evidence of their afternoon together, empty cups and cookie crumbs and napkins covered in sugar art. "Can I get you anything else, Mr. Wilkins?" the waiter asked. Mark looked at the empty chairs, at the table that had witnessed something transformative. This morning, he'd sat here in agony, abandoned and humiliated, convinced this would be another entry in his catalogue of failures. Another reason to stop trying, to retreat behind his walls, to accept that loneliness was his permanent condition. But that morning felt like it belonged to a different person. To someone who didn't know that a little girl with sunflower overalls could see quiet eyes and choose to care. To someone who didn't know that a woman in a yellow dress could look at his brokenness and call it rebuilding. To someone who didn't know that family could be found in the most unexpected places, chosen rather than given, earned not through perfection but through presence. "No," Mark said, a smile beginning to curve his lips, slow at first, then growing, until he could feel it transforming his entire face. "I'm good. Better than good, actually." The waiter smiled, nodded, and left him to his thoughts. Mark watched Elena and Miriam disappear into the crowd, swallowed by the city's endless motion. They turned a corner, and then they were gone, out of sight but not out of his life. Not anymore. For the first time in 3 years, Mark sat alone at a cafe table and didn't feel abandoned. He felt chosen. Chosen by a 5-year-old with a special heart who decided his loneliness was a problem she could solve. Chosen by a single mother who'd recognized her own struggles in his and decided they didn't have to carry them separately. Chosen not despite his wheelchair but including it, as part of who he was rather than an obstacle to overcome. The evening breeze carried the scent of jasmine from somewhere nearby. The guitar music continued, shifting into something more hopeful. The string light swayed gently overhead, casting moving shadows that made everything feel alive, dynamic, full of possibility. Mark sat in his chair, the same chair that had felt like a prison this morning, like the physical manifestation of everything he'd lost, and for the first time since the accident, it just felt like part of him. Not the most important part. Not even the most interesting part. Just one element of a much more complex whole. He thought about next Saturday. About returning to this table, this place that would now forever be marked in his memory as the site of transformation. About seeing Miriam's drawing, about hearing what Elena's week had been like, about building something real and lasting from this impossible afternoon. Mark pulled out his phone, looked at the calendar, and marked next Saturday with a simple note, coffee. 2 p.m. New beginning. Then he signaled for the check, paid for everything including a generous tip, and began the familiar process of navigating his chair through the cafe and onto the street. But familiar didn't mean burdensome anymore. It just meant known. His zone. As Mark rolled down the sidewalk toward where his driver waited, he caught his reflection in a shop window. For 3 years, he'd avoided mirrors and reflective surfaces, had hated seeing the man in the wheelchair staring back at him, a stranger wearing his face but living a life he didn't recognize. But tonight, looking at his reflection, Mark saw something different. He saw a man who'd survived. Who'd broken open. Who'd let himself be seen and had discovered that vulnerability wasn't weakness, it was the only path to real connection. He saw a man who'd spent the afternoon crying in public and laughing with strangers and feeling things he'd thought were dead. He saw a man who had plans next Saturday. Who had people waiting for him. Who had been chosen. He saw a man who was rebuilding. And for the first time in 3 years, Mark Wilkins looked at his reflection and smiled. A new story had begun. Not the one he'd planned. Not the one he'd expected. But maybe, just maybe, exactly the one he needed. The city hummed around him with possibility. Somewhere, Elena was getting Miriam ready for bed, probably retelling the story of the man with quiet eyes who they'd made not lonely anymore. Somewhere, a little girl with a special heart was already planning what to draw for next week. And here, rolling through the evening streets of a city that suddenly felt less cold, less indifferent, less impossible to navigate, Mark felt something he'd stopped believing in. He felt hope. He felt seen. He felt like maybe, despite everything he'd lost and everything he'd survived, his best days weren't behind him. They were just beginning.
And that, my beautiful family, is how a man who thought loneliness was his life sentence discovered that love doesn't wait for perfection. It shows up in sunflower overalls and a yellow dress when you need it most. Mark Wilkins built walls so thick around his heart that even he forgot what was inside. He convinced himself that survival meant isolation, that his wheelchair made him less worthy, that asking for connection was the same as begging for pity. But it took one fearless little girl, Miriam, with her special heart and quiet eyes wisdom, and her exhausted, beautiful mother Elena to teach him the truth he'd forgotten. You don't earn love by being fixed. You receive it by being seen. Miriam lost nothing by stopping. Elena gained nothing by staying. Mark offered nothing but his broken, rebuilding self. And yet, in 4 hours at a cafe table, 3 wounded souls chose each other and created something more powerful than empires or bank accounts. They created family. So if you've ever felt broken, if you've ever sat alone wondering if anyone sees you, if you've ever believed your struggles made you less deserving of love, remember this. Rebuilding is not the same as broken. Your scars are not your sentence. And somewhere, someone is waiting to look past your wheelchair, your exhaustion, your fear, and see the person you've been all along. If this story reminded you that you're worthy exactly as you are, click subscribe, type "I see you" in the comments, and let me know where you're watching from. Tomorrow brings another story of hope, and I don't want you to miss it. You are not alone. You never have to be alone. And you deserve to be chosen, just as you are. Now go forward, my beautiful family, and remember, the best days of your life might be waiting at a table you almost didn't sit at, with people you almost didn't meet, in a moment you almost let fear steal from you. Be brave. Stay open. Let yourself be seen.